Ireland, a land of stark beauty, quaint charm, and deep mystery. In America alone, 40 million people call the Emerald Isle their ancestral homeland. Ireland's history has been dominated by invasions. The Irish adopted the culture of their conquerors, or so the story goes. Now evidence shows that some native Irish didn't conform to new ways of life, but fiercely guarded traditions that are uniquely Gaelic. Is a new chapter in Irish history about to unfold? Traditionally, the Irish have regarded themselves as a nomadic people, believing that villages and market towns were built by invaders, the Vikings and Anglo-Normans or English. But is that accurate? In ancient Irish manuscripts, a single reference is made to a market town built by the Gaelic or native Irish. Was it a real town or just a myth? If true, it could change the way the Irish and everyone of Irish ancestry view the nation's proud past. St. Louis University archaeologist Dr. Tom Finan is determined to unearth the real story. He has spent decades poring over ancient documents and cutting-edge research, looking for clues to where a fabled 13th century Gaelic market town might have been. The years of study have led him to a remote site in Western Ireland. It's a pristine farmer's field that hasn't been inhabited for centuries. After 5 years of extensive, in-depth geophysical research on the site, Dr. Finan, Dr. Alan Hayden, and Dr. Jim Scriver, and a team of student archaeologists are ready to test his theory by pulling back the sod and unveiling the mysteries beneath. Will it rewrite history or prove to be Irish folklore?
Every excavation has the promise of finding something dramatic.
The team knows a true market town would have to meet very specific requirements. There will be signs of everyday life. There will be evidence of commerce. There will be nearby religious or ancient sites. And any structures would be big enough to support a large population.
It has all the hallmarks of medieval society in terms of lordship, in terms of the way landscapes are used. This is all territory that literally nobody has ever worked in.
In early medieval times, Ireland was divided into territories ruled by Gaelic kings or chiefs. But by the late Middle Ages, very few towns were under native Irish rule. The takeover began in the year 1169, when Anglo-Norman invaders seized control of large parts of Ireland. The Anglo-Normans were a ruling class in medieval times. They were from England and the Normandy region of France, and they controlled much of Ireland by the 13th century. Most Irish kings surrendered to the invading Anglo-Norman armies. But in northwest Ireland, the O'Connor high family stayed in power. At a stronghold in the town of Tulsk, some 30 kilometers north, the region's second highest family, the McDermotts, ruled from a fortified castle on a lake. The walls of the island castle on Lough Key still stand today. From the castle ruins, it's a straight line to Dr. Finan's excavation site.
The rock, as a sort of settlement fortification, was connected to the land, the mainland, right? Almost like by an invisible umbilical cord.
It makes sense that a ruling family like the McDermotts, living on an island fortress, would have a settlement on land as well.
If you're living on an island, well, that's for defense, it's for show, but it must be remembered that lordly residences like Lough Key, princely residences and castles and places like that were also centres of estates and administration.
Archaeologist Dr. Kieran O'Connor is a leading expert on European castles. In 2007, he led an architectural survey of the ruins of the castle at Lough Key. The part of the castle most visible today is a folly, built in the 19th century. It was designed by Welsh architect John Nash, whose most famous work is Buckingham Palace. But two other phases are clearly medieval, including a stone wall enclosure.
Opposite, it isn't just an island fortress. There is settlement and buildings linked to it, but on the shore. So the two work together, the shore settlement and the island settlement.
How did these Gaelic kings and lords govern? If there was a market town by the lake, what was life like for the people who lived there?
We've had these presumptions about Gaelic society, that it's a bit backwards relative to English society, that it's a bit backwards relative to medieval society.
Piecing together the mystery requires some detective work. Clues can be found in the ancient writings. The Annals of Connacht were written by monks from an abbey near Lough Key. A parchment text makes reference to a market town at Port na Carrick, Gaelic for Port of the Rock.
And we have a reference to the McDermott's building, Port na Carrick, which is, they call it a market town. The term market is never used in an Irish context. So there's all kinds of connotations that might be connected to this particular site related to its role as an economic center.
It's outside the area where the Anglo-Normans had the control really from the, say, the 13th to 15th century. These areas have seen less work, and there's been less work particularly on the medieval period. If it is a market town, it's a major medieval, basically Irish version of a small town. So that makes it interesting.
Dr. Finan's geophysical research reveals that structures may be buried in this field next to the lake. If the McDermott lords lived nearby in the castle, could this be the site of the lost medieval market town? In the weeks before the first ever excavation, Dr. Finan and his colleague, Donald Haggerty, pore over the research.
You would have all the signs in the landscape of high-status Gaelic lordship. Here at Lough Key, that's exactly what we have. You've got the rock up there, you've got what we're calling the moated site in the field over here. So you sort of have church, you have secular, farming, agriculture, and then you have sort of lordly stuff over here.
A key finding in Dr. Finan's geophysical research is a collection of ring forts. Ring forts are enclosures built of earth or stone. They were used by the Irish for centuries as livestock enclosures or for defense. The area Dr. Finan is most interested in appears to be surrounded by a moat. Several ring forts are nearby.
I can see one there, and I see another one over there.
Yep. There's about 6 or 7 of them.
Moated sites, as built by the Irish, consisted of a deep trench surrounded by stakes or planks, which provided extra protection. In Ireland, it's common to have an earthen ring fort surrounded by a wooden moat.
We know that there's a good number of moated sites that are associated with O'Connor's and McDermott's. Moated sites, when they're built in an English context, tend to represent lower level, lower status lords. In an Irish perspective, though, moated sites are built by the highest levels of society.
The presence of a moat confirms that the site was inhabited by a high-level ruling family, and the location on Lough Key is ideal for trade. The lake connects to the Shannon River, a waterway as important to Ireland as the Mississippi River is to the United States. The river connects to the ocean and to the world at large. Perhaps it's no coincidence that Lough Key and the possible market town are connected to the Anglo-Norman city of Rindoon. In the Middle Ages, Rindoon was a busy trading post.
I wonder if, in a way, if goods and agricultural produce wasn't traded and then brought down the river in relatively small boats like wherries and cots, down river, through the Shannon Lakes, down to Rindoon, about sort of 35 miles away, and then sold on, to bigger merchants who are possibly even exporting some of the produce abroad, and then, of course, bringing in things like wine and trade goods from outside Ireland. Interesting that the first reference to the market town actually comes at a time just after the foundation of Rindoon.
These are the waterways by which the Vikings even would have accessed the centre of Ireland.
But access to the ocean brings with it the possibility of invasion. In 1235, an Anglo-Norman army invaded the area around Lough Key. The Gaelic Irish were skilled warriors who knew how to use the landscape to their advantage. They hid in thick forests and bogs, impassable to the invading cavalry's large horses and heavy armor. The McDermotts and O'Connors managed to hold the king's army at bay for a while. But soon the army reached Lough Key. The two families escaped to the rock, 150 yards offshore, beyond the range of siege weapons and catapults.
So the English decide to go to a neighboring ecclesiastical village. They tear down the village and they build what were called fireboats. So they take these boats and they lit them on fire, apparently, and they pushed them out to the rock. And this sufficiently scared the people on the rock. They surrendered. Then there's a reference to the English staying on the coast of the lake for 3 weeks, 4 weeks. It sounds like they were having a good old time.
Will Dr. Finan and his team find evidence left behind by these invaders? If artifacts from warfare are found, it would reinforce what's in the ancient literature. But Dr. Finan's main focus remains on the scant reference to an Irish commercial town. However, very little is known about the daily life of the native Irish. What sorts of artifacts would show how people lived in a town ruled by Irish kings and lords? Another archaeologist may have some answers. Dr. Michelle Comer is excavating a farmstead in the west of Ireland, used for centuries by the ruling O'Loughlin family. While Dr. Finan's work centers on a market town on a moated site, Dr. Comer has unearthed artifacts from a Gaelic family compound within a stone wall enclosure. What she's found at her excavation in the Burren begins to bring into focus how the Irish lived when free of outside control.
We have here a native ruling family continuing to live in a traditional manner from the 10th century, so what we would refer to as the end of our early medieval period, right through the medieval period, right through to the start of the 17th century. They are continuing to live like their ancestors did before them. They are not copying this new culture, so they're not building a castle or a town or a village. So we have, for example, what is essentially a medieval scissors or small shears. Other evidence of textile working include sewing needles, like this little bone example. So this item is called a spindle whirl, and it's used for transforming raw fleece from your sheep into a yarn or a thread.
Other artifacts found at Carriconnell include a bronze dress pin decorated with a hound's head, fragments of gold, a silver ring, and a tuning peg for a harp.
Discover the past with exclusive ancient history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians from History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to explore everything from the wonders of Pompeii to the rebellion of Boudica and the mysteries of prehistoric Scotland. Immerse yourself in the captivating stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
They were probably hosting feasts. So the Gaelic chieftain who resided here, part of his daily activities would have been hospitality. So he would bring other people here, both socially inferior and, I suppose, his peers. They would come here, there would be a great feast with lots of different meats and cereals and foodstuffs, music, games, perhaps poetry. But there's no denying that the people here were quite wealthy and quite important in this particular community.
Even in this remote location, the O'Loughlin family traded extensively. Dr. Comer's excavation has uncovered beads made from amber and exotic glass.
Now, this is interesting because amber is imported into Ireland. It comes from the Baltic region, so it's not found here naturally. In the late 10th century, much of the contact with the outside world here in Ireland is via the Vikings. And of course, this comes from the Baltic region, from what was Viking territory at the time. This one probably dates to the 15th or 16th century. It's a little glass bead, red, white and blue, was made in Venice in Italy. So far-flung contacts, even at the later period.
Dr. Comer's excavation has unearthed English coins from the 16th century. These forms of currency prove that the native Irish traded far and wide. Yet this is a culture that remains connected to an ancient past. Ireland's history extends back many centuries, and connections to prehistoric times are deeply rooted. Gaelic kings and lords staked claim to the lands of their ancestors. Near Dr. Comer's excavation in the Burren is Pulnabron Dolmen, a Neolithic portal tomb dating back to 3500 BCE.
But in the early medieval and medieval period, the ancestors had a more political role to play. They could justify your territorial claim, for example, and that happened here. So when this settlement was built in the late 10th century, it was built on top of an earlier late 6th, early 7th century AD burial containing human remains. So they were deliberately incorporated into this high status, if you like, semi-royal settlement. So if you can link yourself to that, you can say, well, my ancestors have been here for thousands of years. Of course it's my land. Whose else would it be?
The O'Connors and McDermotts also lived near lands settled by ancient ancestors. The Carrowkeel tombs are within view of Dr. Finan's excavation site. These Neolithic monuments were built in 4000 BCE.
If the McDermotts are building a moated site on top of a ring fort that is also built near a Neolithic settlement, that's a pretty important conclusion. If you're building directly on top of things, in a sense, we're controlling the past. We're taking the past and making it ours. So the McDermotts, as they build these things, what they're saying is, we are the overlords here. We are connected to the past. We are connected to the landscape. And it creates this web, in a sense, that in Gaelic Ireland, it's sort of the way that lordship is often exerted.
Despite those ties to a pagan past, by the Middle Ages, Christianity was widespread. Gaelic rulers seeking to ensure their salvation invested in abbeys, places of worship and burial. 2 abbeys are near Dr. Finan's excavation site, one on Trinity Island, the other in the town of Boyle. Both abbeys were supported by the McDermott family.
In the medieval period, there were no unbelievers, and they were ensuring eternal salvation and also high-status burial rites at these abbeys.
Archaeologist Dr. Miriam Klein conducted a major excavation of the abbey on Trinity Island. She's an expert on the religious landscape of Ireland.
It also kind of raised their social status and their political status to have these, but primarily for very good religious reasons. And these, of course, would have been the only stone buildings, probably the only stone buildings in the region. So it meant that they must have really dominated the panorama of the lake with these, 2 abbeys out on it. Boyle Abbey was the burial place for the McDermott lords until after the dissolution in the second half of the 16th century, when Rory McDermott was buried at Holy Trinity Abbey.
All of the preliminary evidence points to the presence of a truly Gaelic town on the shores of Lough Key. There's a good chance that, like at Dr. Comer's site, the excavation will unearth artifacts from everyday life and evidence of trade. The O'Connors and McDermotts are buried in nearby Christian abbeys, within view of ancient pagan monuments. And geophysics shows some large structures that indicate this was a busy market town. But proof only comes when the spade hits the ground. Student archaeologists from across the U.S. and Canada join Dr. Finan and his colleagues as excavation begins. The team will spend weeks uncovering the secrets of the site. Stakes are high. What they find has the potential to rewrite some parts of Irish history.
There's a very good chance that what we're actually looking at is like a nexus of several ring forts, plus other enclosures that we know are in the fields and in banks and other things that make up what might be and what you consider an Irish town.
The first decision is exactly where on the large field to dig. High-tech drone photography by Dr. Paul Nasons helps point the way.
This aerial survey that Paul Nason's Western Aerial did for us right after the grass was cut really shows the banks and the ditches surrounding the site pretty clearly.
The main platform.
That darkish brown, that's where stone actually comes up to the surface.
In any excavation, archaeologists focus on one area that is most likely to yield artifacts. A test trench of 8 meters by 10 meters will be the workspace, with the rest of the site preserved for future excavation. Based on the research, the team directs the students to dig a test trench here, the spot where a ditch and structure may be located.
We know that these ditches can often become treasure troves for archaeologists because we find bone, we find, pottery fragments, we find just the normal refuse of daily activity. There's a heavy, dense area of stone here that doesn't show up anywhere else on the site, so that's pretty good. We think it might be some kind of structure.
In the cold rain, alternating with record heat, the team of students and professors begins their back-breaking work. Early in the excavation, the professors teach the students how to recognize artifacts in the soil.
It's a very interesting, climate to be working in. Once you're that close to it all the time, you can see little differences.
Students learn about soil stratigraphy. Like rings on a tree, layers of soil reveal the passage of time.
It's fresh. Now, when you scrape it, it all looks exactly the same. These are difficult layers to follow.
You learn to look in the cross sections for different rock patterns going down the side, if they dip down or if they stay level, and you learn to tell the differences and consistencies of the dirt.
I enjoy the puzzle, so I like the stratigraphy. That's where the feel, sound, color, all that comes into play.
Dr. Jim Scriver and the students excavate a portion of the trench where the layers of soil reveal a timeline. Artifacts found higher in a trench are from a more recent time period. Ones found at the bottom are older.
This is our medieval activity. This is the destruction of the ring fort. This is this fill of the ring fort ditch before it was destroyed.
Found a rib and then another tooth today.
Really, the great thing is that we've hit really good archaeology very quickly. It's actual things that we can identify, particularly up on top here. We've got what we would call a revetment. In other words, it's a wall.
It's only day 3 of the excavation, and the team has found what appears to be a kiln used to dry grain.
These are small, usually keyhole shaped. Usually have a round chamber where there would have been a large wicker basket with the grain in it. Opening off this somewhere would be a flue to a fire. This would be like a tunnel. So the flames would come in. Now the flames hopefully would only get to about here. But then the hot air, this will act like a chimney, would draw the air through. So the hot air would be pulled up and dry the grain.
The kiln is large and in very good shape. The size alone points to evidence of a commercial trading center.
It's the beginnings of proof that these were estate centres, farming centres for the Rock of Lough Key.
Kiln is could be anything between, say, the 13th and the 16th century, 17th century. And the size of the kiln that's not just one guy drying his grain from his own farm. That's a communal sort of drying kiln. It starts to fill out, put flesh on the bones to some extent of that term market town.
Whether it's local people who are producing the grains and then, they're using the kiln and then ultimately they use a mill or stuff is being brought in from further afield. I mean, this opens up a lot of questions about what exactly the market economy is all about.
The team finds a kernstone, used for grinding grain into flour.
It was broken and reused as part of the wall. You can see the curving striations running around the stone here. The lower stone was stationary.
After days of painstaking excavation, the kiln is revealed, and it's proving to be even more impressive than Dr. Finan and his team had imagined.
It really surpassed our expectations in both its size and its construction. It's a very beautiful kiln. It is perfectly preserved as far as we're concerned.
Any grain that is found is carefully collected for later analysis.
It could be something like a whole lot of grain that's burnt and squashed together.
Grain samples can be used to pinpoint the date of the kiln. It's an important piece of information for the researchers.
It's become an enigma and a mystery and all of that. It's not what we expected, but what we expected at the same time.
After long days of excavation, the archaeologists review the geophysics. They notice that shapes similar to the kiln are scattered across the field.
There's an area in the middle that is very low resistivity, and then surrounding it is an area of very high resistivity. So in other words, there's stone with a gap in the middle. It's not a naturally occurring sort of feature.
Now that we've seen that, we think that there's other similar geophysical responses have come up on other parts of the site, and we think there's a possibility that some of these, looking at the size of them, might also be kilns.
If a number of grain drying kilns are present, it's more evidence that this may be the mysterious market town. The tedious work of excavating continues. As enthusiasm begins to wane, a discovery on day 13 gives the team just the boost they need.
Coin.
It's a long cross penny, silver penny. That's nice, that's a medieval coin.
The coin dates to the 1270s. Finding the coin places the site firmly in the 13th century.
I mean, you do get the sort of a little initial adrenaline when you see the coin in the dirt. If you think about the excavation as a puzzle where we don't necessarily have all the pieces at once, it's like we're sort of finding the pieces as we dig. And so finding a coin like that is like finding a corner, because it really allows us to lock in the layers above it and then also the layers below it. And so that gives us a point from which we can work backward.
We know from day one that there's so much interchange and interaction going on. And then, in fact, we've got, late 13th century coin on the site. Opens up any number of different questions.
While the coin is proof of commerce with the outside world, a small piece of bronze may be even more significant to understanding life in this Gaelic market town.
It's an offcut. You can see it's very sharp edges. Offcut from a larger sheet.
Showing us there's metalwork going on the site.
There is a trade network in place where they can get the raw materials. There is financial capital in place for them to acquire the materials. There is know-how in place to make bronze, as opposed to just trade for it. And if you put that together with these mysterious bumps that are appearing in some of the geophysical work that may be individual other kilns, then we may have something really, really interesting going on the site here.
Some artifacts provide evidence of when the market town was in use.
I found 6 medieval horseshoe nails. There was a difference in the soil, the color of the soil. When I dug it up, it was this orangish red color, and it really stood out.
We know that the native Irish start shoeing horses relatively quickly after the English arrive in the late 12th century. The fact that we found 10 of this particular style, called a fiddle nail, is pretty interesting. It works us into that 1200 to 1275 range.
The artifacts that Dr. Finan and the team have uncovered prove that there was a busy trading town at Lough Key, one that was in use for many centuries.
What Dr. Finan and his colleagues are doing are opening up a whole new area that we didn't know anything about.
The earliest artifact is an 8th century tool for leatherworking.
A piece of china.
And the latest is a piece of 19th century pottery.
The artifacts he's found are really excellent. Very rare to find coins, medieval coins. The right things are coming up and the right contours of it are coming up too.
The team's archaeology is writing a new story of Ireland, showing how a proud people lived, worked, and ruled when free of outside control. They conducted international trade in busy market towns. They processed grain and were skilled bronze makers. All the while, they kept Gaelic traditions alive. They were a spiritual people, embracing Christianity, yet continuing to live near prehistoric pagan burial sites. It's a society far more complex than anyone imagined.
The whole lake is actually a beehive of activity in the 13th century.
And so much more may lie beneath the surface. As the mystery of the market town yields its secrets and proves to be fact rather than fiction, another mystery emerges.
We're the first ones to identify this large ring fort over here.
It's enormous. It's enormous.
A new aerial survey reveals what appears to be a massive 2-tier ring fort, a mere 200 meters from the excavation.
It's a completely new site. It was not known until Paul Nasons flew over the area and picked it up. It was just, you could see humps and bumps, but it made no sense.
That clump of trees just popping up, that's where the large bivalve ring fort that we noted in the aerial photography.
The bivalve, or two-tiered ring fort, is on a site called Longfort Hill. Vikings called their settlements Long Forts.
And that term was brought into Irish to represent something loosely along the lines of temporary encampment.
A possible connection to Norse invaders only adds to the mystery of the new site. Bivalve ring forts of this size were used for royal ceremonies, including the inauguration of Gaelic kings and lords. Could this rock outcropping on the hilltop, overlooking the market town, be one of the largest ring forts ever discovered in Ireland?
If I was going to extrapolate, part of me wonders if this enclosure here is not really settlement as much as it is something to do with lordship.
It has a great vantage point to the rock. It overlooks the moated site. You would almost expect there to be something like a ring fort at a point like that.
Dr. Finan returned to Ireland to gather data on the large structure. He's hoping to uncover more secrets buried beneath this Irish soil. But for now, centuries of agriculture conceals the evidence. Even with the latest scientific technology, improvements in drone photography may provide some answers. Drone aerial photos are increasingly clear and precise.
I would not be surprised if the elevation differences that appear to be the ditch and the ring are probably 1 or 2 centimeters difference. It's literally that accurate, the aerial survey. So it shows up in the image, but actually working the geophysics there, we weren't able to find much.
While information gathered on the large structure is inconclusive for now, Dr. Finan's work in Lough Key is enabling scholars to look at Irish history in a whole new way.
What they're doing now is coming up with a whole new vision of what Ireland may have been in those times, and who would have thought that Ireland could have been an international trading center during the 13th century.
I think we have clearly identified at least 4 more kilns on that site. And if they're being used concurrently, then that basically means they are producing and dealing with a ton of grain. We've got bronze working, which suggests that there's artisans there. We know that they're using the lake as an economic resource. As a market town, you actually have a lot of economic activity going on. So the puzzle pieces come together and they actually do fit.
Ireland is a land that closely guards its secrets. For these archaeologists, uncovering the true story is a lifetime of work. But they all agree the effort is well worth it.
It takes a lot of work to uncover this past. It's a very exciting sort of endeavor because it's all new.
Intelligible in the way that you see something and you suddenly realize, well, you're the first person to have touched that or stood on it or picked it up in 800 years, 1,000 years. And it gives you a little bit of a thrill, I suppose, but it also gives you an intimate connection with the past.
Knowing that someone like 1,000 years ago used this it's really just humbling.
For those who grew up in Ireland, this new archaeology is reshaping their view of the past.
I suppose when I was studying archaeology as a student, when it came to learning about the archaeology of medieval Ireland, all we learned about was the archaeology of castles and abbeys and towns and villages. Essentially, an archaeological landscape associated with the Anglo-Normans. The era prior to the Anglo-Norman arrival, the early medieval period in Ireland, is marked by tens of thousands of settlement enclosures across the landscape, in every part of the island, perhaps up to 500,000 in population.
There's a lot there that folks don't necessarily realize is actually present.
There's a whole landscape emanating out of the southern shore of Lough Key. So there's a lot of archaeological remains in this area, and if you marry that to the available historical evidence and literary evidence, you can come up with a very good idea as to how people lived in this area during 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century.
It's only in recent years that we have begun to search out the answers, to try and find those people again that seem to have become invisible. So we're actually beginning to fill in that gap, put them back into the picture, if you like.
The Irish medieval market town is much more than folklore. A Gaelic Irish way of life is beginning to be understood and documented for the history books. Yet the story continues to evolve. While many questions have been answered, some mysteries remain unsolved for now. These archaeologists vow to continue the quest in the search for Ireland's lost history.